The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Tombstone's main street as Jack Loner Mackenzie adjusted his worn hat and guided his horse toward the saloon. At 43, his weathered face told stories of countless lonely trails and hard-earned wisdom. The silver star on his chest had been retired 5 years ago, but the instincts of a former lawman never truly faded. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story now." Mister, please!" The desperate whisper came from behind a stack of grain sacks near Morrison's general store. Loner's hand instinctively moved toward his Colt. 45, as he turned to see a small figure emerge from the shadows, a boy no older than 10, his clothes torn and dirt-streaked, eyes wide with terror. "Easy there, son," Loner said, dismounting slowly. "What's got you spooked?" The boy, Timothy Walsh, though Loner wouldn't learn his name until later, glanced nervously around the busy street before stepping closer. "You're the cowboy who used to be sheriff, ain't you? The one they call Loner?" "That's right. What's this about?" Timothy's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "It's about St. Mary's, the orphanage. Everyone thinks Sister Margaret and Father O'Brien are saints, but they ain't helping us kids. They're doing something terrible." Loner studied the boy's face, noting the genuine fear etched in every line. In his years as a lawman, he'd learned to distinguish between childish tales and real terror. This was the latter. "That's a serious accusation, boy. St. Mary's has a fine reputation in this town. That's what makes it so perfect for them," Timothy said, his small fists clenching. "Nobody would believe a bunch of orphans over the holy folks. But I seen things, heard things. Kids go missing, and when we ask about them, Sister Margaret says they got adopted by families out east. But I know better." The boy's words hung in the desert air like a storm cloud. Loner had heard whispers about the orphanage, how it had grown remarkably wealthy for a charitable institution, how the children seemed unusually quiet and withdrawn during their rare appearances in town. He'd dismissed it as gossip, but looking into Timothy's eyes, he felt the familiar stirring of justice that had once driven him to wear a badge. "Why come to me? Why not the current sheriff?" Timothy's laugh was bitter beyond his years. "Sheriff Hawkins? He's in their pocket. Gets a nice donation to the town fund every month from the orphanage. Plus, his own nephew got adopted last year, and Hawkins acts like the boy never existed." A chill ran down Loner's spine. He remembered young Billy Hawkins, a spirited 12-year-old who used to help at the livery stable. The boy had indeed disappeared, and when Loner had casually asked about him, Sheriff Hawkins had curtly mentioned an adoption before changing the subject. "What exactly did you see, Timothy?" The boy's eyes darted around again before he continued. 3 nights ago, I snuck out to the well behind the orphanage. I was thirsty, and they don't let us drink much water after supper. I heard voices coming from the cellar, Sister Margaret and some man I didn't recognize. They were talking about shipments and buyers and how the merchandise needed to be clean and healthy. Loner's jaw tightened. The implications were horrifying, but he needed more than a child's testimony to act against such respected figures. "I hid behind the well and watched," Timothy continued. "They brought up 3 kids from the cellar, kids I ain't seen in weeks. They were all dressed nice, but they looked scared and sick. The man gave Sister Margaret a bag of money, and they loaded the kids into a covered wagon. Did you recognize the man?" "Never seen him before, but he had a fancy suit and a gold watch chain. Oh, and a scar right here." Timothy traced a line across his left cheek. "He called Sister Margaret Maggie like they were old friends." The details were too specific, too consistent for a child's imagination. Loner felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, the same feeling that had driven him to become a lawman in the first place. "Why haven't you run away?" Timothy's shoulders sagged. "Where would I go? I got no family, no money. And besides, there are other kids still in there, little ones who can't protect themselves, Someone's got to help them. The boy's courage in the face of such danger reminded Loner of his younger self, the idealistic deputy who believed he could save everyone. That man had died along with his wife and daughter in a fire he couldn't prevent, leaving behind only the hollow shell known as Loner. But looking at Timothy's determined face, he felt something stir that he thought was buried forever. "All right, son, I'll look into this. But you need to be careful. If what you're saying is true, these people are dangerous." "I know," Timothy said solemnly. "But I also know you're the only one in this town who might actually do something about it." As the boy melted back into the shadows, Loner stood in the dusty street, his mind racing. St. Mary's Orphanage sat on the hill overlooking Tombstone like a benevolent guardian, its white walls gleaming in the afternoon sun. But if Timothy was right, those walls hid a darkness that would shake the town to its foundations. That evening, Loner sat in his small cabin on the outskirts of town, cleaning his guns and planning his next move. The smart thing would be to ride away. He'd done his duty to society for years, and it had cost him everything he'd ever loved. But Timothy's words echoed in his mind. Someone's got to help them. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky blood red, Loner made his decision. He would investigate St. Mary's, not as a lawman bound by politics and procedure, but as a man driven by justice. Whatever he found there, he would see it through to the end. The hunt for truth was about to begin, and Loner Mackenzie was riding into the most dangerous territory of all, one where innocence was currency and children's lives hung in the balance. The next morning brought an unseasonable chill to Tombstone, as if the desert itself sensed the darkness lurking beneath the town's peaceful facade. Loner had spent a sleepless night planning his approach to St. Mary's, knowing that a direct confrontation would only alert the perpetrators and potentially endanger more children. He decided to start with Martha Henderson, the town's seamstress, and one of the few people who regularly visited the orphanage to mend the children's clothes. If anyone had noticed something amiss, it would be her sharp eyes and kind heart. Martha's shop sat tucked between the barber shop and the telegraph office, its windows displaying carefully stitched dresses and shirts. The bell above the door chimed as Loner entered, and Martha looked up from her sewing machine with surprise. "Well, Jack Mackenzie, haven't seen you in town for weeks. What brings you to my humble establishment?" Martha was a widow in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been one of the few people to show genuine kindness after his family's death, never pushing for conversation but always offering a warm meal when he looked particularly worn down. "Morning, Martha. I was hoping to ask you about St. Mary's. You still do their mending?" Her expression shifted slightly, a shadow crossing her features. "I do. Why do you ask?" Loner chose his words carefully. "I've been hearing some concerns about the children there. Thought you might have noticed anything unusual during your visits." Martha set down her needle and thread, her hands folding in her lap. For a long moment she studied Loner's face, as if weighing whether to trust him with something precious and dangerous. "You know, Jack, I've been sewing for that orphanage for nigh on 8 years now. Used to be the children would chatter and laugh when I came by. They'd show me their drawings, tell me about their lessons. But in the past 2 years," she paused, her voice dropping, "they've become so quiet, so fearful." "Fearful of what?" "That's just it. I don't rightly know. But I've noticed things. Children who were there one week, gone the next. When I ask about them, Sister Margaret always has the same story, adopted by loving families back east. But Jack, I've been around children my whole life, and I know the difference between a child who's excited about a new family and one who's been broken somehow." Loner leaned forward. "What do you mean, broken?" Martha's eyes grew distant. "Last month I was fitting little Sarah Collins for a new dress. Sweet girl, maybe 7 years old. She flinched every time I touched her, like she expected to be hurt. And when Sister Margaret came into the room, Sarah went white as a sheet and started trembling. Did you ask the girl about it?" "I tried, but Sister Margaret never left us alone, always hovering, watching every word. And when I did manage to whisper a question to Sarah, she just shook her head and looked terrified. The pieces were starting to form a disturbing picture. Loner pressed on. Have you noticed anything else? Any visitors to the orphanage? Changes in routine? Martha nodded slowly. There's been more traffic lately. Well-dressed men coming and going at odd hours. And the children, they're not allowed outside as much as they used to be. Sister Margaret says it's for their protection. But from what? A knock at the shop door interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Loner could see Sheriff Hawkins approaching, his badge glinting in the morning sun. Martha quickly resumed her sewing, and Loner pretended to examine a display of buttons. "Morning, Martha," Hawkins said as he entered, his eyes immediately fixing on Loner with suspicion. "Jack, didn't expect to see you in town so early." Sheriff Tom Hawkins was a man in his late 30s, with a carefully groomed mustache and an air of self-importance that had grown more pronounced since taking office. He'd never liked Loner, viewing the former sheriff as a threat to his authority. "Just picking up some supplies," Loner replied casually. "Martha here was telling me about her work at the orphanage. Sounds like Sister Margaret keeps those children well cared for." Hawkins's expression relaxed slightly. "Indeed she does. St. Mary's is a blessing to this community. Those children are lucky to have such devoted caretakers." "Must be rewarding work," Loner continued, watching Hawkins carefully. "I imagine the adoptions bring great joy to everyone involved." Something flickered in the sheriff's eyes, too quick to identify, but definitely there. "Yes, well, finding good homes for orphaned children is always a priority. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have official business to attend to." As Hawkins left, Martha waited several minutes before speaking again. "That man gives me the shivers," she whispered. "Ever since his nephew Billy went to that loving family, he's been different, colder somehow." Loner filed this information away. "Martha, I need you to do something for me, but it might be dangerous." Her chin lifted with determination. "If it's about helping those children, I'll do whatever I can. Next time you visit the orphanage, try to get a count of how many children are actually there. And if you can, find out their names. Can you do that without arousing suspicion?" "I think so. I usually inventory their clothes to see what needs mending. It would be natural to ask about sizes and which children need what. Be careful. If I'm right about what's happening there, these people won't hesitate to silence anyone who gets too close to the truth." That afternoon, Loner decided to conduct his own reconnaissance. He positioned himself on a ridge overlooking St. Mary's, using a pair of field glasses he'd kept from his army days. The orphanage was a substantial two-story building surrounded by a high wooden fence. From his vantage point, he could see the main courtyard and part of the garden. For hours, he watched and waited. The children he observed seemed subdued, moving in small groups under the watchful eye of Sister Margaret, a stern woman in her 40s, with sharp features and an authoritative bearing. Father O'Brien, a portly man with thinning hair, appeared occasionally, but seemed more interested in the administrative building than the children themselves. As the sun began to set, Loner's patience was rewarded. A covered wagon approached the orphanage from the back road, the same route that would allow visitors to come and go without being seen from town. The driver was a man in a dark suit, and even from a distance, Loner could make out a scar on his left cheek. Timothy had been telling the truth. The wagon stopped at a side entrance, and Loner watched as Sister Margaret emerged to greet the scarred man. They spoke briefly before disappearing into the building. 20 minutes later, they returned with 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, all appearing to be between 8 and 12 years old. The children moved like sleepwalkers, their heads down, their steps mechanical. They were loaded into the wagon without resistance, without tears, without any of the emotion one would expect from children being separated from their home. As the wagon disappeared into the gathering darkness, Loner felt a cold fury building in his chest. Whatever was happening at St. Mary's, it was far worse than simple neglect or abuse. These children were being systematically broken and sold, their spirits crushed until they offered no resistance to their fate. He thought of Timothy, still trapped within those walls, and of all the other children who depended on the adults around them for protection. The boy had been right. Someone had to help them, and that someone was going to be him. As Loner made his way back to town under the cover of darkness, he began formulating a plan. He would need allies, evidence, and most importantly, a way to get inside St. Mary's without alerting the perpetrators. The game was afoot, and the stakes couldn't be higher. In a world where children's innocence was being stolen and sold, Loner Mackenzie was about to become their unlikely champion. The hunt for justice had begun in earnest. 3 days had passed since Loner witnessed the midnight transaction at St. Mary's, and the weight of what he'd seen pressed heavily on his conscience. He knew he needed help. One man, even a former sheriff, couldn't take down an operation this size alone. But in a town where the orphanage's influence ran deep, finding trustworthy allies would be like searching for water in the desert. His answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell had arrived in Tombstone 6 months earlier, one of the few female physicians brave enough to practice medicine in the rough frontier town. She'd faced skepticism and outright hostility from many residents, but her skill and dedication had gradually won over even the most stubborn critics. What most people didn't know was that Dr. Hartwell had a personal reason for coming to Tombstone. Her younger brother had disappeared from a similar orphanage in Colorado, and she'd been following a trail of suspicious adoptions ever since. Loner found her in her small clinic, tending to a miner's broken arm. She was a woman in her early 30s with auburn hair pinned back practically and intelligent green eyes that seemed to see everything. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd learned to trust her own abilities in a world that constantly questioned them. Dr. Hartwell, Loner said as she finished bandaging the miner's arm, "I wonder if I might have a word with you privately." She studied him with those perceptive eyes. "Of course, Mr. Mackenzie. Please have a seat." Once they were alone, Loner chose his words carefully. "I understand you've had some professional interactions with St. Mary's Orphanage." Her expression immediately sharpened. "What kind of interactions do you mean?" "Medical examinations of the children, health assessments for potential adoptions." Dr. Hartwell set down her instruments and faced him fully. "Mr. Mackenzie, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. Why are you asking about St. Mary's?" Something in her tone told Loner that she already suspected the truth. He decided to take a calculated risk. "Because I believe something terrible is happening to those children, and I think you might have seen evidence of it." For a long moment, they stared at each other across the small room. Then Dr. Hartwell walked to her desk, pulled out a key, and unlocked a drawer. She withdrew a leather journal and placed it between them. "I've been documenting my concerns for months," she said quietly. "The children I've examined show signs of systematic abuse, not just physical, but psychological. They're malnourished despite the orphanage's claims of providing adequate care. Many show symptoms of being drugged with laudanum or similar substances." Loner felt his jaw clench. "Drugged? To keep them compliant, I believe. And there's something else." She opened the journal to a specific page. "In the past year, I've been asked to examine 43 children for adoption readiness. Of those, 31 have subsequently disappeared from the orphanage." "Disappeared how?" "According to Sister Margaret and Father O'Brien, they were all adopted by families in the East. But Mr. Mackenzie, I've been corresponding with colleagues in major eastern cities, and none of them have any record of these adoptions. It's as if these children simply vanished." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, painting a picture more horrifying than Loner had imagined. "Dr. Hartwell, what I'm about to tell you could put us both in danger." She leaned forward. "I've been in danger since the day I started asking questions about those children. Tell me what you know." Loner recounted his conversation with Timothy, his observations from the ridge, and the midnight wagon he'd witnessed. Dr. Hartwell listened without interruption, her face growing paler with each detail. "My God," she whispered when he finished. "It's worse than I thought. They're not just abusing these children, they're selling them. The question is to whom, and for what purpose?" Dr. Hartwell's expression darkened. "There are men in this territory, wealthy ranchers, mine owners, even some politicians, who have particular appetites. Children who have no families, no one to miss them, would be valuable commodities to such people. The implications hung in the air like a death sentence. Lohner had seen evil in his years as a lawman, but this level of systematic cruelty against innocents made his blood run cold. "We need proof," he said finally. "Something that will stand up in court and can't be dismissed as the ravings of a disgraced ex-sheriff and a female doctor. I might be able to help with that." The voice came from the clinic's back door, where Timothy Walsh stood in the shadows. Both adults turned in surprise as the boy stepped forward. "Timothy!" Lohner exclaimed. "How did you—" "I followed you from your cabin," the boy said matter-of-factly. "Figured you might need someone who knows the inside of that place." "Doctor." Hartwell knelt to Timothy's level, her medical training evident in the gentle way she examined his face and hands. "You're malnourished," she observed, "and these bruises on your wrists. Sister Margaret don't like it when we ask questions," Timothy said with a shrug that broke both adults' hearts. "But I got something that might help you." He reached into his shirt and pulled out a small leather ledger. "I stole this from Father O'Brien's office 3 nights ago. It's got names, dates, and amounts of money. Lots of money." Lohner took the ledger with reverent hands. The pages were filled with meticulous entries in Father O'Brien's careful script. Children's names, ages, physical descriptions, and beside each entry, a dollar amount that made Lohner's stomach turn. The sums ranged from $50 to $200 per child, with notations about special requests and custom orders. "This is it," Dr. Hartwell breathed. "This is the evidence we need." But Timothy shook his head. "It ain't enough. They got another book, a bigger one, that Sister Margaret keeps locked in her private office. That one's got the names of the buyers and where the children get sent. Without that, you can't prove who's behind all this." "Where is Sister Margaret's office?" Lohner asked. "3rd floor of the main building. But it's always locked, and she keeps the key with her at all times." Dr. Hartwell stood, her face set with determination. "Then we'll have to create a distraction that gets her away from that office long enough for someone to search it." "That's someone being me," Lohner said grimly. "No," Timothy interjected. "It should be me. I know the building better than anyone, and if I get caught, they'll just think I was wandering around like kids do. If you get caught, they'll know someone's onto them." The courage of this 10-year-old boy humbled both adults. Here was a child who had already risked everything to expose the truth, now volunteering to walk back into the lion's den. "Timothy," Dr. Hartwell said gently, "what you're proposing is incredibly dangerous." "More dangerous than letting them keep hurting kids?" Timothy shot back. "I seen what happens to the ones who get taken away. They don't come back, and nobody ever talks about them again. If we don't stop this, it's just gonna keep happening." Lohner felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the same sense of purpose that had driven him to become a lawman in the first place. But this time, it wasn't about upholding the law or maintaining order. This was about protecting the innocent and fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. "All right," he said finally. "We do this together, but we do it smart, and we do it right. One mistake could cost all of us our lives and leave those children with no hope at all." As the 3 unlikely allies began planning their assault on St. Mary's secrets, none of them noticed the figure watching from across the street. Sheriff Hawkins had been keeping an eye on the former lawman, and what he'd observed was troubling enough to warrant immediate action. The game was about to become much more dangerous for everyone involved. The plan was set for the following Sunday during evening services, when most of the orphanage staff would be occupied with the weekly religious observance. Dr. Hartwell would create a medical emergency requiring Sister Margaret's immediate attention, while Timothy would slip away to search the private office. Lohner would position himself outside as backup, ready to intervene if things went wrong. But as Sunday morning dawned gray and threatening, their carefully laid plans began to unravel. Timothy didn't show up at the predetermined meeting spot behind Dr. Hartwell's clinic. When an hour passed with no sign of the boy, Lohner's instincts screamed that something had gone terribly wrong. "We have to assume he's been discovered," Dr. Hartwell said, her face pale with worry. "The question is, how much do they know?" Their answer came in the form of Sheriff Hawkins and 2 deputies surrounding the clinic with drawn weapons. "Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell and Jack Mackenzie," Hawkins called out, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "You're both under arrest for conspiracy to commit burglary and defamation of a religious institution." Lohner's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Dr. Hartwell placed a restraining hand on his arm. "There are too many of them," she whispered, "and if we resist, Timothy and the other children will pay the price." They emerged from the clinic with their hands raised, and Hawkins smiled with cold satisfaction. "Thought you were clever, didn't you? Following the good sister around, filling that boy's head with lies about the orphanage?" "Where's Timothy?" Lohner demanded. "Safe and sound at St. Mary's, where he belongs. Sister Margaret is very concerned about the influence you've had on the poor child. She's arranged for him to be adopted immediately, tonight, in fact." The words hit Lohner like a physical blow. They were going to sell Timothy to cover their tracks, and there was nothing he could do to stop it from behind bars. As they were marched toward the jail, Lohner caught sight of a familiar figure watching from the shadows near the telegraph office. It was Martha Henderson, and the look in her eyes told him she understood exactly what was happening. The jail cell was small and cramped, designed more for drunk cowboys than serious criminals. As the sun set and darkness fell over Tombstone, Lohner and Dr. Hartwell sat in frustrated silence, knowing that with each passing hour, more children were being lost to the evil they'd tried to expose. "I should have seen this coming," Lohner said bitterly. "Hawkins has been watching me since I started asking questions." "We all underestimated how deep this corruption runs," Dr. Hartwell replied. "But it's not over yet." As if summoned by her words, a soft scraping sound came from the window high above their cell. A rope dropped down, followed by a familiar voice. "You folks ready to get out of there?" It was Martha Henderson, accompanied by two men Lohner recognized as honest ranchers who'd had their own run-ins with Hawkins' corruption. "Martha, what are you doing?" Lohner whispered as she worked on the window bars with a crowbar. "What should have been done years ago," she replied grimly. "I went to St. Mary's this afternoon with a special delivery of clothes. I saw Timothy locked in the cellar with 6 other children, all of them drugged and prepared for transport. There's a wagon coming tonight at midnight to take them away." The window bars gave way with a soft screech of metal. Dr. Hartwell went first, followed by Lohner, who felt a surge of hope for the first time in hours. "How many men does the orphanage have?" he asked as they made their way through the dark streets. "Sister Margaret, Father O'Brien, and 3 hired men who arrived this afternoon," Martha reported. "But there's something else you need to know. I overheard Sister Margaret talking to someone on the telegraph. She mentioned a name, Vincent Carver." Lohner's blood ran cold. Vincent Carver was a notorious criminal who operated throughout the Southwest, dealing in everything from stolen cattle to human trafficking. If he was involved, the operation was far larger than they'd imagined. "We need weapons," Lohner said, "and we need to move fast." The group made their way to Lohner's cabin, where he retrieved his rifle and extra ammunition. Dr. Hartwell armed herself with a shotgun, while Martha and the 2 ranchers, Joe Miller and Sam Rodriguez, carried their own weapons. As they approached St. Mary's under cover of darkness, Lohner felt the familiar calm that came before action. This was what he'd been trained for, what he'd lived for during his years as a lawman. But tonight, it wasn't about upholding the law. It was about protecting innocence itself. The orphanage loomed against the star-filled sky, its windows glowing with lamplight. A covered wagon waited in the courtyard, and Lohner could see armed men moving around the building. "There," Dr. Hartwell whispered, pointing to a basement window. "That's where Martha saw the children." They split up according to plan. Martha and the ranchers would create a distraction at the front of the building, while Lohner and Dr. Hartwell approached from the rear. The goal was to reach the children before the wagon could depart. The distraction came in the form of a fire in the orphanage's barn. Nothing that would spread to the main building, but enough to draw the guards away from their posts. As shouts filled the night air, Lohner and Dr. Hartwell slipped through the basement window. The cellar was a nightmare of stone walls and iron bars. 7 children sat huddled together in a corner, their eyes glazed with laudanum, but still aware enough to recognize rescue when they saw it. "Timothy?" Loner whispered, kneeling beside the boy. Can you hear me? Timothy's eyes focused with effort. Knew you'd come, he slurred. The book. Sister Margaret's got it with her. Don't worry about the book now, Dr. Hartwell said, checking each child's condition. We're getting you out of here. But as they helped the children to their feet, footsteps echoed on the stairs above. Sister Margaret appeared at the cellar door, flanked by 2 armed men. In her hand, she held the leather ledger that contained the names of all the buyers. Well, well, she said with cold amusement. The heroic ex-sheriff and the meddling doctor. You've caused us considerable inconvenience. It's over, Margaret, Loner said, his hand steady on his gun. The whole town will know what you've been doing here. I don't think so. Sister Margaret's smile was reptilian. You see, you're all going to have a tragic accident tonight. A fire, perhaps, that claims the lives of several trespassers who broke into our orphanage with criminal intent. The standoff stretched taut as a wire, 7 drugged children caught between salvation and damnation. Then Timothy, summoning strength from somewhere deep inside his young soul, lunged forward and grabbed the ledger from Sister Margaret's hands. Run! He shouted, tossing the book to Loner. Chaos erupted. Gunfire echoed through the cellar as Loner and Dr. Hartwell fought to protect the children. Sister Margaret screamed orders while her men tried to regain control of the situation. When the smoke cleared, Sister Margaret and one of her men lay dead. The other had fled into the night. Father O'Brien, captured by Martha and the ranchers, was already confessing everything in exchange for leniency. As dawn broke over Tombstone, the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed. The ledger contained names of prominent citizens throughout the territory, men who had purchased children for unspeakable purposes. Vincent Carver's network stretched across 3 states, but with the evidence from St. Mary's, law enforcement agencies were already moving to shut it down. Timothy stood beside Loner as they watched the surviving children being cared for by Dr. Hartwell and volunteers from the town. The boy's eyes were clear now, the drugs wearing off, and for the first time since Loner had met him, he looked like what he was, a brave child who had helped save countless others. What happens now? Timothy asked. Loner looked down at the boy, who had shown more courage than most grown men. Now we make sure this never happens again. And we find real families for all of you, families that will love and protect you the way you deserve. As the sun climbed higher in the Arizona sky, Loner felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. The darkness had been exposed. The innocent had been protected, and justice had prevailed. It wasn't the end of evil in the world, but it was a victory worth fighting for. And in the dusty streets of Tombstone, a former lawman known as Loner had found his purpose again, one rescued child at a time. Hello? How are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.